Predicted everybody hates me because it's the end of the break and everybody was having a wonderful conversation, and so was I. But we want to hear from this panel. So let me start teeing it up as people come in. Just to introduce our moderator, Keith Gremban, who's director of the Institute for Telecommunication Sciences, ITS, part of the amazing asset that we have thanks to NTIA here in Boulder. He's a computer science PhD, and one of the things that I discovered is that he's a martial artist. So when we're talking about enforcement, first dan Aikido, second dan Shotokan Karate, we're going to be okay. And in fact, we're going to need that kind of discipline because what I've learned is some of the sharpest, the most interesting people are DARPA program managers, and we've got 3 of them on this panel. One of them is Keith, so have fun.
Thank you, Peter. This is my first chance to be on this side of the table, so this is going to be very interesting. Brief introduction of the other panelists. So John Chapin is currently a professor at Carnegie Mellon University, and he was with DARPA at the same time I was. We were in the same office, the Strategic Technologies Office. Next is Preston Marshall. He's the program manager of wireless networking at Google, also a former DARPA PM.
Same office?
Same office. At one point, I worked for him. At another point, he worked for me when I was at DARPA, and he was a contractor. Next down.
Performer. Sounds better.
Performer, all right. Next is Tom Power, who is currently Senior Vice President and General Counsel at CTIA.
And not a DARPA program manager.
And formerly the Deputy CTO at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And then Harry Surden is a professor here at the University of Colorado Law School, formerly with the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics. So it's an interesting panel here. We've got some serious techies and some serious legal experts, and it's sort of a fact that any system is half political and half technical. So hopefully we'll get some good interaction going here. So for the first question, I'd like to build on the previous panel and turn to John Chapin and ask about, from your point of view, what are the biggest challenges we've got to look towards in enforcement?
Sure. So to boil it down to one sentence, I'd say we need to figure out ways to make enforcement cheaper, more effective, and faster while preserving key freedoms. So 4 big challenges. Why does it have to be cheaper? Because for all the reasons we heard on the previous panel, we need a lot more of it. We can't afford as much as we need today, and yet we need a lot more of it because we're depending on RF devices in so many new ways, and we need to resolve any interference issues that arise more quickly. So it has to be cheaper so it can be more pervasive. It has to be more effective despite new technologies that make it harder. And since this is sort of our technology panel, I'll take the bulk of my time to talk about what that means for me. To unpack that, I'm going to use a formalism called the OODA loop, O-O-D-A, observe, orient, decide, act. It's a common way of thinking about control systems. So observation, that's how you gather the initial data on which you're going to make decisions. Observation of interference issues today and with emerging technologies is much harder than it was in the past. Let me highlight 2 key technical changes that are coming really fast. First of all, our systems are trending towards becoming very dense with lots of short, low-power links. That means it's very hard to observe their behavior from a distance. And Charlie Cooper talked about that in the previous panel. You can't see something from a distance. That means your sensor network has to be dense, or you have to drive around a whole lot to get close to the target. Both of those things increase cost. The other major trend is towards multiple antenna systems, directional radiation of energy, or MIMO technology. What that means is that no matter where my sensor is sitting, I can't guarantee that I'm going to hear all of the nearby transmitters. Some of them might be pointing away from me. So in the limit, I'd have to have sensors in every spot in the environment to be sure that I fully characterize all the transmissions. That's clearly unaffordable. So we have a very significant technology problem just in observing what's going on in the spectrum. That's the first step of the OODA loop. Second step, orientation. That is where you're trying to make sense of the data that you've measured. 2 key problems. First of all, I see some energy in my measurements. I see a transmission. I want to figure out which device or network that came from. Well, we've got all sorts of technology trends that make that a hard question to answer. For example, we're going with software-defined radios that are going to be jumping around in frequency, going to be changing what waveforms they're using all the time. So you can't just look up in a static database, hey, I saw this signal, who did it come from? We've also got a technology trend towards bursty spectrum use and towards more noise-like waveforms. These things all make that question of identifying where something came from very hard. The second part of orientation, I see something that's out there, I know who it came from, now who do I attribute responsibility to? Who's in charge? Who made the decision or is legally responsible for that? There's all sorts of reasons that make that a hard question to answer, but I'll just ask it by analogy. I mean, all of you own PCs and laptops, right? How many of you are willing to take full legal responsibility for every single transmission that your device does on the internet? Right? I mean, but if it's not you, who is it? And we face that same issue in the radio spectrum as things get more complex. I'll give you a couple of specific cases of interest. What happens when the interference occurs because the device is misconfigured, but actually the vendor made it too easy for the end user to misconfigure it? This was the major cause of interference in the 5 gigahertz DFS range. What about a case where an operator fails to upgrade the OS with the latest OS provided by the software vendor, and that security breach gets exploited by attackers? Okay, so
by Nexuses.
Yeah, by Nexus devices, right? We have this issue in the Android ecosystem. What about when a third-party SaaS is involved? Was it the device or was it data that came from the SaaS? So there's all of these complex issues. Always the SaaS?
Define the SaaS.
Oh, okay, right. Who's in charge of that? So
That was a trick question for the last panel, remember?
the spectrum.
No, seriously.
I'm sorry. I thought we agreed in the previous panel that we didn't have to expand that acronym. Spectrum Access System for the 3.5 gigahertz band. So there's all sorts of interesting complexities associated with the challenge of attributing responsibility for interference. If you're going to do an enforcement action, you have to do it against the right entity. All right, so we've talked about observe and orient. The remaining two parts are decide and act. So we have to determine whether harmful interference occurred. We have to determine whether there are protected rights. We have to determine who needs to change their behavior and how much. And we have to cause that entity to change their behavior as required. All of these things have to complete before the interference gets mitigated and the enforcement is successful. Today, that whole decide and act is a case-by-case, human-centered process. And it can take a long time. It might be, as we had a wonderful presentation on all of this from a panel that Rebecca organized the day before ISART earlier this year, very educational. And I think some of the information from that is available on the web. Is that right? I recommend it for anybody. I certainly learned a tremendous amount. But it might be the Enforcement Bureau representative on the spot who commands a mitigation action. But if that doesn't work, there's an administrative process at the FCC. Then it becomes a legal process. And at the very end, they have to get the U.S. Marshals involved to go in and confiscate the equipment. Speeding that up is a major challenge. So these are all hard problems in the whole OODA loop. And things that make it particularly difficult, aggregate interference. We heard about that in the earlier group. Political issues, what we call the garage door problem, which we can talk about if anybody doesn't know about that. And situations where all parties involved feel that they are operating within the rules, like, say, the T-Mobile and SiriusXM example from the previous panel. So those are our big three challenges: pervasive, effective, cheap, fast enforcement. For all those technical reasons, it's hard. But I want to close with the other part of my problem statement, that we can do this while preserving key freedoms of our current system. So what's hard about that? Well, we need to preserve privacy, and we have a risk that our enforcement methods are going to result in systems that collect large amounts of information about user behavior. We have to avoid that. That's a big challenge. We have to preserve permissionless innovation. And there's a risk there, because if you look at technical ways of solving those problems I was talking about, the first set of things that's going to come to your mind are things that require systems to either comply with or avoid certain specific signals or behaviors. And every regulation we make like that makes it harder for the person with that great new next idea to do something in a completely different way. And we need to preserve freedom from political meddling, right? So we have a real challenge where if our resources and systems are unable to keep up with the demand, then we're going to get into a selective enforcement world. And selective enforcement is an invitation to political interference. My final note is just that, unfortunately, these various freedoms are also at risk if we do nothing. Because if we don't improve the way we do enforcement, and we're going into a world of greatly increased spectrum sharing, then the alternative is a very fine-grained regulatory control in advance on a second-by-second basis of when people get access to the spectrum. And prior restraint has all sorts of problems in the First Amendment world. Well, it has the exact same set of problems here in the spectrum access world. So we need really good enforcement improvement to solve those problems. Thank you.
No, thank you. So let's go to the other end, the legal end of the table here. Any comments or additions to that?
They reserved our opening remarks.
Yeah, we could go a million places. It's kind of depressing almost to hear that. There's so many challenges, and we're seeing such a change in how, from just the wireless broadband perspective, deployment, particularly in the 5G world, and the densification of the networks, which is hitting on a whole lot of your problems in terms of being able to understand and identify and then mitigate interference.
Thank you. Harry?
Yeah, one point that you said that I thought was particularly salient is this idea of fixing rules in law that have the effect to the potential to diminish innovation because it forces some sort of activity. And I think it's a really underplayed point in law, the effect to which kind of the ossification of the law can actually affect progress. And it's not something lawmakers are typically thinking about.
Preston?
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about crowdsourcing. I have 4 things, just like my predecessor here, but they're completely different. I think we need to create 4 things. We have to have a tech approach to this. These tech approaches that are obvious require a collaboration approach.
I think you're already onto the question I'm going to get to.
Oh,
later.
I thought
This
you
is
were
still on
asking
the
that
first
question.
question. No, rebuttal.
No, he's completely right.
Hey!
Okay, people mark your calendar. By the way, just as I move on to the next question, I'm taking notes on this because for those of you who don't know that the ITS, the Institute for Telecommunication Science, we're the research and engineering branch of the NTIA. And so part of our job is looking 5-10 years down the road and trying to make sure that when these problems need to be addressed, we've got the technology to address them with. So I got to make sure I take notes on all these good problems. Okay, so let's move from the challenges enforcement to what the technology is that's going to be most disruptive on this. So, as government regulatory bodies are often accused of being too reactive and not proactive. So let's think proactively a little bit here. What are the big wrenches that can be thrown in the works? And I'll toss that out to Tom to start with.
Doing these panels has actually gotten easier because my answer to every question is the same, 5G. I didn't even listen to the question. But I'll try to make that the right answer. I think just to kind of back up a little bit, clearly the whole point of this conference and the reason we're here is we're seeing such an increase in demand for wireless technologies, and we're all having to play much more nicely with each other in the limited sandbox that is the spectrum. And you can just look back at the history of the FCC just the last few years. Every big proceeding they're doing is focusing on how to share better and how to use more efficiently. So you look at the incentive auction that's going on now, 600 megahertz, no longer going to be reserved just for broadcasting. It's going to be for wireless broadband and unlicensed as well. The 3.5 gigahertz proceeding, which is still very much a work in progress, but a very unique new approach with 3 tiers of prioritized access. The Spectrum Frontiers item this year, although they sort of divvied up unlicensed from licensed, within the license there is sharing that our members are going to have to do with the incumbent satellite users, with the Defense Department. And this is happening because you're seeing this explosion in usage, just in what is the lifetime maybe of some of the students, but a relatively short time when you think about technology and policy and regulation. And it's being driven, I think if you took somebody from 50 years ago and brought them and just had them walk around for a day and said, what's the biggest thing you notice difference? It wouldn't be cars or architecture or clothes or music. It would be everybody walking around with one of these, I mean, it's just phenomenal. CTIA had the great benefit this summer of a rock star intern from Boulder Law named J.B. Canifax, who's sitting in the very back of the room, who has renamed these face magnets, you know, because, and from the FCC, of course, this is a huge challenge because, as Fred was saying in the last panel, it used to be just hand out spectrum, you know, guard bands in the middle, and everybody was happy. And now, as demand just goes skyrocketing, they're trying to stay ahead of the game, as you just alluded. But we don't have any of the answers to all the things that John just pointed to. And you know, there was that old quote from it was attributed to the great hockey player Wayne Gretzky, who said, "I don't focus on where the puck is. I try to focus on where the puck's going to be." That kind of attitude, you know, is especially kind of, I don't know, for companies and innovators and disruptors, like that's kind of their mindset. It's a little hard for the government to fully adopt that, though, because you know, they should be accommodating innovation and disruption, allowing for it, even promoting it. But I don't know that you want them to be the innovators and disruptors. So because the puck, they've got to let the puck go wherever the puck's going to go, and not guide it with too heavy a hand. So I give the commission a lot of credit for trying to keep this balance just right and being pretty successful at it. Because once the commission makes a decision, you know, we all invest a lot of resources in advocacy in front of the commission because it does sort of get locked in, and it does get ossified, and so they got to get it right. There's a private equity firm can fail on most of its investments and be a hugely successful firm, but the government sort of has to get it right every time. I think getting back to my answer, 5G. We all have sort of pet projects or pet ideas of what the big 5G thing is going to be. It's transportation or healthcare or whatever it is, and we'll just have to wait to see. But I think what we do know is the parameters of 5G or the characteristics of 5G that we're shooting for is greater capacity and much lower latency. And so that's going to introduce all these cool new services, but it exacerbates the problem because if you develop these cool new low latency, you know, if you are the subject of a remote surgery, you know, that's really dependent on low latency, that's a lot more important than if you're, you know, making a restaurant reservation or sending an email or surfing the web. And so as we develop these great new services that are going to take advantage of all that 5G has to offer, this challenge gets even worse, and it does go, as I said before, to the sort of densification problem, because one of the things with 5G, because the propagation is over so much a smaller area, we're going to be building a lot more transmitters into infrastructure all over the place. But again, raising just in spades all the challenges that John brought up.
Thank you. Preston, do you have any comments on that?
I still haven't figured out how 5G is the answer, but that's okay. We should give him a buy on that as a group.
You agreed with everything John said. Come on.
He was ex-DARPA. He has to be right. No, I think the 5G, the locality, whether we hit it in 3.5 or we hit it in 5G, I think that's a trend in cellular, whatever happens with 5G. You can't put more 700 megahertz towers out there. You're going to have to put something up somewhere up in 3.5. So I think locality we can kind of divorce from that. Everything will be local. And then, so I think Tom's right on that. I just think it's sort of here now. I don't think we're really playing to where the puck is at.
Okay, Harry?
I just more had a question for Tom. Could you give more examples of the types of activities that would be enabled by 5G so we can understand what's going to be disruptive?
You know, lots of people have different examples. You know, one area that some folks are envisioning is you would create these super hotspots presumably in public areas, whether it's train stations or libraries, where anybody could go and be able to download huge quantities, you know, much more than you can do today, particularly over wireless, in a very short period of time. You know, this remote surgery is something that people are talking about. I'm not stepping up to volunteer quite yet, but I don't know. You're probably doing a lot more thinking about this magic.
Not remote surgery, no. No, I think The problem is all the high latency ones also have all this reliability on it. And our community is not capable of producing the kind of reliability that makes people comfortable porting over, and certainly interference is part of it. GPSs you really can't trust anymore. So I think we've actually gone backwards in our willingness to put truly life-critical things on wireless, which would not be what one would have expected a decade ago.
John, any?
Yeah, well, the one thing we haven't talked about is that going along with the densification of use of the spectrum is a densification of computing and storage at the edge. And so maybe that's the disruptive trend that we could leverage to push back against this, if we can figure out a way to do it in a way that's privacy protecting. So, I mean, we're talking about, every device that's out there operating in the spectrum could also be measuring its own parameters and measuring what it sees are in the spectrum. You're talking, we could talk about a megabyte of storage in every power socket and a gigabyte of storage in every mobile device dedicated to this purpose, which in a few years wouldn't be a bad thing. We're talking about possibly a terabyte of storage in every access point could be dedicated to measuring and storing what's happened. And we're talking about distributed queries that we could do against all of that data to start trying to figure out what happened and quickly track down interference. So I'm put in mind of a wonderful blog post from Pierre from a few years ago about the RF mirror worlds, which I think is still worth reading for everybody, because maybe although we can't actually go out and measure what happened, we can, in the digital domain, go out and figure out what happened through the traces that were left in all of this storage. So that's the disruptive, different way of doing things. If we can figure out a way to do it, that's privacy preserving.
Thank you. So let's go from the other side of the coin, from the challenges to the solutions. So we've talked a lot about what could go wrong. How do we fix those? How do we develop what are the enforcement technologies that are going to allow this all to happen? I'll toss that out to Harry.
Yeah, so part of my research I look at in the world is in automated enforcement and compliance, which is ways we can use computer technology to make it cheaper, more efficient, and more reasonable to comply with various rules and regulations. So I'm in the business of teaching reasoning by analogy. So one way to answer this question is to look at the way automated enforcement is happening outside of the spectrum world, and maybe we can analogize to the spectrum world to see where it might go. So in terms of automated compliance, there's generally two approaches that are quite different that I'm going to lay out for you that are currently being used out there in the world in small quantities when it comes to automated legal compliance. So the first one I'll call embedded law. And this generally involves representing existing laws or regulations in some sort of computer understandable form, and then embedding the logic of the law either in hardware or software. So really what does this involve? This involves taking actual laws written in English, to the extent that legalese is English, written by lawmakers, courts, and legislatures, and translating to the best that you're available to a set of computer instructions that either exactly replicate the logic or have functionality that affects the underlying logic of the law. And this allows the computer to comply either with the purpose of the law to some degree where it's being used, or to literally attempt to comply with the law. So where is such embedded law being used today? Well, we do actually see it out there in the world of self-driving cars, which is another research area of mine. If you look over at Google and some of the other companies that are in this area, part of the analysis that self-driving cars have to go through about when they're deciding when and if to move is where is it safe and legal to move next. So built into there, either implicitly or explicitly, is some representation of English language driving laws represented in the computer system, and the computer is trying its best to follow those laws. We also see this in the tax compliance world. So if you look at software like TurboTax or any of those related pieces of software that people use to file their tax returns, if you think about what's going on there, somebody, in the case of TurboTax, it's the company Intuit, has looked at the personal income tax code and made a translation from the logic of the personal income tax code and represented it in a series of computer understandable questions, intermingling human judgments as part of the analysis. And then the computer literally computes your tax liability, and it's such an acceptable computation that the IRS generally accepts the computation by the program like TurboTax. And then you were talking about software and cognitive radios. You see that a little bit in the wireless context, where either implicitly or explicitly there is spectrum avoidance rules which reflect various regulations out there. So that's kind of a top-down rules approach, which is one way you can do it. And it's not widely being used, but it's being used in certain pockets of law. A quite different approach, and it comes from a different angle, is what I'll call the machine learning statistical approach. And basically, this involves analyzing large amounts of data and trying to detect violations using various techniques in artificial intelligence or statistics. So I'll give you an example of where this is being used in automated compliance and violation detection. Most prominently, this is happening in insider trading in finance, where the various agencies that look after insider trading comb through vast amounts of trading data and look for statistical anomalies that might be indicative of insider trading. So maybe somebody takes a large position in a company that they've never taken a position in before, and then the next day a takeover is announced of that company and the stock rises. So government agencies use this kind of statistical analysis to kind of guide their investigation. And there are other ways. These are more after-the-fact violation detection, whereas the first example I gave is sort of ahead of the fact, trying to comply or avoid violating in the first place. So I think both techniques potentially have their place in this world, but as John mentioned, there are considerations that you need to think about for both techniques, including privacy. Is certainly, when you're gathering large amounts of data, inevitably there will be privacy violating or privacy sensitive information in that large amount of data. There are various limitations, which I'm happy to talk about at some point in a follow-up question of both techniques. They're both beneficial in some areas and the other, but I'll throw it out to the panel, having laid out those general parameters, what would be most appropriate in the spectrum area.
Preston, I'm sure you have.
Well, the embedded law one is sort of interesting, because I think that's the experiment we're doing in 3.5 for the SAS, Spectrum Access System. Get that out there quickly. Where I think we probably have the most complex characterization of behavior that the FCC's issued. It's always issued complex specs, tables of bandwidths and all. But in 3.5.5, it's talking extensively about how things behave, both in the cloud and in the device. And the problem is that the government is pretty good at checking that your spec analyzer all fell within these masks. No one, including all of industry, has ever been very good at checking behavior, or else we wouldn't have 3,000 exploits in our software and all. So I just think that that's the problem. It's swapping one problem for another, and it may be a better one. But there is zero infrastructure for the government to say, we understand how this box, or even worse, this aggregation of box and cloud is or is not compliant. And that's the burden it takes. To some extent, we face that burden in 3.5.5 anyway. Maybe we'll do well or not, but I think it makes it grow more significantly in a time when the government's looking like smaller and smaller and trying to do narrower and narrower things. And now we're asking it to do something which industry's done a relatively poor job of itself.
Thank you. John or Tom, any further?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to underline Preston's point, which is that...
That's only because I agree with you, right?
Thank you. No, I would say this at a broader point, which is that the FCC historically has regulated a hardware-intensive industry, and in a very short period of time, that has transitioned to become a software-intensive industry. And the FCC, in both its certification sides and its design sides and its enforcement sides, really has to chase hard to catch up, and that change hasn't happened yet. So I think If you look at the Federal Aviation Administration or the Food and Drug Administration for medical device regulation, they've all gone through this transition from hardware-centric to software-centric in the past. And now it's the time for the Federal Communications Commission to do that and to deal with the kinds of complexities, like what rules do we have for how much testing you have to do on the software that controls the spectrum access decisions that are made by your devices? The answer is none. We don't put any regulations on the software development process. The Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Aviation Administration do put regulations on the software development process itself because they know they're never going to catch everything at the testing phase downstream. So those are the kinds of transitions we have to make. I'll go back to the initial question here, which was, what are the approaches we might take to trying to solve some of these problems? And we heard one already from Charlie Cooper about the station ID that we might start having devices help us out with identifying where a transmission came from by periodically saying, hi, this is WAMU FM 97.9, or whatever the digital equivalent of that is. Two things that I've talked about in the past, including I think at this forum in the past. One is black boxes. So maybe we ask our devices to keep a log of their spectrum access decisions, and we build mechanisms by which we can query those logs downstream. And then you could very rapidly, if you know there was a problem in an area, maybe you could rule out 99% of the devices in that area, and you're left with a much smaller set that you have to actually go and investigate who was causing a problem. The other idea was one where the question is, how do you mitigate interference quickly if you have a lot of devices out there, especially if they're unlicensed devices that aren't under the control of a professional operator? And the suggestion that I made in a paper a number of years ago was to turn that problem around. We called it time-limited leases. It's like when you get a trial piece of software, it's good for 30 days, and then you have to pay the company to get the key that lets you to keep it going. So if your device will only operate for a certain period of time, and then it has to get a key from somewhere else to keep operating, then the process of distributing those keys is one that can be effected to ensure that all devices that are causing a problem get off the air within a certain limited amount of time, much more quickly than you can through any other mechanism that at least I'm aware of. So there are some technical things that we could do down, to help us figure out where a problem is coming from and to help us mitigate it once we've identified it. But I think the field of things that we need to do is still very large.
Thank you. Okay, so now let's talk about how we get to where we need to be. We've talked about the problems and the technology, and we're now, in the last 50 years, as someone else brought, we've gone from thousands of transmitters to millions of transmitters to billions when we get into IoT. How do we architect a system that can monitor and enforce the spectrum rights on this? Preston?
All right, now that I'm going in the right sequence. I was getting a root canal when this panel was organized. So,
was that preferable?
Well, I did the root canal and not the panel. So I'm going to talk about, I think, 4 things that an infrastructure needs. It needs incentives for people to do it. I'm going to assume it's crowdsourced. I will sort of channel Maya Medin's thoughts at the FCC TAC. There has to be a technical approach to do it. I think we have to create a framework that is collaborative, because I don't think any one person does it. And then lastly, the last phase of actually execution and mitigation and penalty and consequences, I will leave to my left. But if we can at least point, I'll take the burden of the first 3 to point them to people. So first of all, incentives. It's very clear the government's not going to do this. We are talking about monitoring of devices that talk 50 to 100 meters. As we move into 3.5 and then beyond into 6 and then certainly into 5G, where the world will get better. We're talking 200-meter range. Well, if you work out the population of there are 10 million square meters in kilometers in the United States. We're not going to monitor it with the government. And so we have to create an incentive structure for individuals. We should be first accepting that some degree of privatization of this. I kind of think of a bounty. If you're a defense contractor and you don't like your management and they're cheating on timesheets and you turn them in to the government, you get half of the take. The False Claims Act. Maybe we do that if the lawyers can actually create good enforcement actions, we split the money with the person who pointed them to them. We have to create an incentive for people to go out and innovate in industry. I think as a spectrum access system operator, the FCC has tried to put a little bit on us in 3.5. In the public notice, it talks about how we will resolve interference complaints and all. which sounds awfully close towards doing enforcement. I imagine that every cable C-band dish that has a loose water-corroded cable, they'll call us up first that we should resolve it. So it's given us a little bit of privatization, although there's no consequences in how we act. But I think that's the first step. Admit the problem and step up and create a framework where we make it incentivized. Bitcoin wouldn't work if we didn't incentivize people to do Bitcoin mining. But we create a little bit of that transaction, and I think there's a good model there. The second is tech approach. You can fight the $25 SDRs, or you can think that they're the solution. Fighting them is not going to work. You're not going to shut down Alibaba. So I think we should be embracing them and try to make it so that everybody wants to have an SDR in their house that is reporting to some cloud, and then it gives them a piece of their
What's an SDR?
Oh, software-defined radio. I'm sorry.
Can you just say couple of sentences about what software-defined radio is?
Software-defined radio is a radio that you can program to do most anything as compared to, say, a handset that can only do one or two things. They're now $19 because of the European digital standard on eBay, compared to $1,000, which they were even a year ago. So they're very, very inexpensive, built into devices. If we do that, then we have the monitoring. There was an interesting DARPA experiment, non-technical. It looked kind of like something to laugh at almost when it was done, but I hearken back to it. And that was when this Obama administration came in. One of their projects was red balloons. And somehow none of us was there. It was between us. But it's kind of dumb if you think about it. They put up 10 or so red balloons over the United States, and they said, we'll give $100,000 or $10,000 to the first person who says where they all are. Well, obviously, seeing red balloons is not hard. But what it really did was incentivize people to think about, how do I induce people to associate with me and report it to me and not someone else? Because I'm going to give them a share of that $10,000. So if these guys can find a way to give $1,000 for every illegal radio that's out there, we create a structure for people to reach out into these boxes and make them actually become profit centers for people. If you monitor in areas where we see bad enforcement issues, where there's lots of illegal activity, where in the CBRS band, where professional installers have lied and put it somewhere else because they couldn't get a grant, where you've seen those behaviors, then you have an advantage in affiliating with these. So I think there's a layer of this. I think as an engineer, yeah, we just put it in the cloud and we crunch it.
Can I jump in on that for just a minute?
It's your panel, Keith.
I mean, part of the punchline on the red balloon was that when the Department of Defense was asked to look at the problem, they estimated that finding 8 red balloons located at random locations around the U.S. would take weeks of surveillance equipment to find, and it took something like 48 hours or less than that to crowdsource the information. So in reference to John's point about tightening this loop between detection and enforcement, that's why the red balloon challenge and the crowdsourcing is so relevant.
Some of the teams I think it was MIT that won, but they published how they incentivize people to come and participate. So I think it's a different model, but I think it's an example that not only does crowdsourcing work technically in that we collect lots of data, but that people can create very involved incentive structures that make people want to participate in this. So in the 3.5 band, the FCC put a requirement that devices have to sense. For the first time, we'll have a band where every device essentially can become an enforcement agent. From the engineering side, we have no idea what that means. Some people think it means just give what LTE already, other people think it means something very sophisticated. But somewhere in there is at least crossing the Rubicon, if you will, that the networks we deploy are also potentially usable for enforcement. What we don't have is the larger structure to make use of that data. The incentive structure and the other enforcement structure at the other end of the pipe. But the building blocks for the first time are actually here. And the last thing it takes, other than someone to go collect the money and give us half of it, is transparency. In the last panel, there was discussion a bit about proprietary data, and I can tell you that in the process of designing the 3.5 ecosystem, at least one of the participants have had severe concern over sharing their data. But others accept that that's just the price of shared spectrum. The world's a little different, and part of that is that your data is public. It's being crowdsourced over open signal anyway, so maybe not that exciting. But it does mean transparency. It means license records. If you go in ULS and you plot stuff and you take a look, I can think of one particular part which we did. What? Universal licensing, FCC's database. It didn't match at all what's actually out there. So some of our records aren't very good. But when they get arrested and brought in because their records are bad, they'll fix it. It'll have incentive. So transparency may be the biggest burden, as the last panel discussed, but it's the price of doing shared spectrum. Otherwise, we just could shut the FCC down because there is no more spectrum to give out. There's not going to be any new, fresh. So it's either share it and exchange data and share information, or this whole business stops.
Thank you. Harry, you had a comment on that?
Yeah, I really liked your points. I want to focus on the incentives part, because you actually raised what I think is 3 different models of how incentives can be created. One is the False Claims Act, which is top-down from the government. Another one is Bitcoin, which is architected into the system. And then yet a third one was the red balloons, how MIT, through private action, came up with their own.
But they all depend on that first one. Someone's got to trickle some money in. They just divide the money up. There has to be money.
Yeah, so I wanted to throw it at, do you have an intuition about which is best for?
Well, I think you have to, I think the money flow comes from enforcement. I believe that that's enabling. And the other two I don't see as so much competitive as synergistic. You know, the horrible thing would be if it was really successful, it would kill itself off. So we hope that enough people do disobey the law to keep the cash flow, to keep it worthwhile doing. I mean, that would be the worst problem, is if it was massively successful. It would then kill itself, and we would have a control loop problem. Every 5 years, it would be good. But yeah, I think you still need that inflow of penalty money. And we have to worry about, what constitutes all of the provenance of the records and all. So there's more than enough work for lawyers. It doesn't take any work away from lawyers, but it's really changing lawyers from worrying about cases to creating a metastructure that lets the engineers and the computers go out and create all the cases for you. I mean, that's what think of it. We're doing admission control in 3.5 without ever going through the FCC. You come into a cloud computing, and 500 milliseconds later, you're going to get a license. You get a call sign. We don't know how to make them, but we get a call sign. And you get a license to operate. So we've taken the people out of the licensing process. Now we need to take the people out of the enforcement action and focus on a metastructure.
Tom, John, any?
Yeah, always agree.
The only comment I'd make would be, we talk about the key challenge is billions of devices. I wonder if we can reduce that number a little bit. Which is to say that instead of the unit of concern being the individual device, maybe it's the collection of devices carrying out a certain function. And if we could divide it by a factor of 10 or 20, because all the light switches in your house, you don't need to care which one it is. It's just your entire house's ability to use that particular service gets shut off if you're causing an interference problem. And you could say the same thing for all of the other different things that involve lots of different transmitters. So let's blur our eyes a little bit. And I guess it's maybe a legal question about what is the unit of responsibility that you're going to try and enforce on. But we should not consider it to be the device, I don't think, in this world.
Interesting. Okay, well, I think we're at the time now to open it up to questions. So the first question comes from a student. Can we get a microphone down here?
I'm not sure whether
Yeah,
I'm an ITP graduate student. So I'm not sure I'm very much relevant about the current topic, but since we are discussing about the solution of this spectrum crunch and all that, so why not we are thinking of something called Li-Fi, which is the concept is like, instead of using the radio frequency for the communication, you are using the visible light frequency for the communication. That can be a possible solution for all this because the visible light spectrum is wide enough to address a lot of problems. Although they have got the limitations, but it can be a possible solution to a certain extent. And it has been introduced since 2011, the first demonstration. So do we have any initiative towards that?
You want to go off that far up in the electromagnetic spectrum?
Your call.
You've got a experience?
If you may experience the same thing when you get to 70 gigahertz in 5G, that it doesn't go through anything. But most of it's hard to generate power at optical. It's hard to illuminate over a large spherical area. Just if you look at the efficiency of a laser versus the efficiency of a AB1 or Mode D amplifier. And so it's got some inherent limits on the amount of generate power, and it doesn't go through anything. But it might have a place. But it's not going to replace anything. It's going to be an enhancement because of the limitations in the use case.
The one thing I'll say is I'm going to quote Dale Hatfield, who said that he felt that one of the largest mistakes that was made in the post-World War II of the FCC history was not putting any receiver standards on the TVs, and that made it very hard to innovate in the future. Well, I think you say there's plenty of spectrum available at visible light. Yes, but when a first successful application gets out there and it has a really poor quality receive filter on it, then the next application can't get deployed because it's going to cause interference over a very wide set of colors to that receiver. So it's not just the raw medium, it's the receiver standards and the filter qualities and everything else that's going to impact there. So that's just my hobby horse. Is we need to be looking ahead to optical, and we need to make sure that that first successful consumer application has a good quality receive filter on it. End of hobby horse.
All right, another question? Wow, really? Okay. So identify yourself and then ask the question, please.
Will do. Nathan Lawrence, I'm a third-year law student. Wearing gym shorts right now, so obviously some of this is maybe a little bit above my head, but Mr. Marshall.
You haven't seen my lab.
You mentioned.
You should see Preston at the office. It's a different look.
I work for Google. I use this once a year until it wears out.
In the closet in the back normally. Got it. Okay. You mentioned that there's some private market solutions to enforcement issues, but stipulated that money from penalties was necessary in order to enable that. Could you discuss maybe the use of market forces, some sort of cap and trade, some sort of, I'll stop there before I can let you answer the question. Thank you.
So I think even whether you do market forces, cap and trade, secondary markets, there's people who want to hedge interference. There's a couple good books on that. Way beyond the penalty, but they're even more dependent on enforcement, probably because they're playing right on margins. So Verizon and AT&T kind of do cap and trade with each other to some extent.
Aren't there some contractual solutions to that?
Well, I think we're here. I think when we talk enforcement, we're taking that someone advertently or inadvertently has chosen to violate the contract. It could be the noisy light switch that John mentioned that is inadvertent, and most probably are. LED lights are going to become a horror story for us. Mercury vapor already are. So, there are a lot of inadvertent. But I think the assumption is that this is, I'm not sure what the legal term is, but one or more parties is not executing the contract. Then we have interference resolution, which is another layer, which is not enforcement. No one did anything wrong. Everybody followed the rules. But we engineers failed, and there were cases. You might think Light Squared, which was wanting to operate in satellite spectrum. Presumably would have been legal for them to do that, but GPS receivers were blocked. No one envisioned it when they built GPS receivers. No one was wrong. No one was illegal. But one of them had to lose big time, $6 billion. So there's sort of, hierarchy of things. There's interference resolution, which is largely, the government sold something twice, essentially. But then we have enforcement here, which is the deliberate or accidental violation of contract. Maybe not even known by the guy who's doing it. But
to push back even a little further, though.
Fine.
Sorry, can you just hold a second for the people on the stream?
To push back on that a little further, if you don't mind, it seems to me that where there are still contractual solutions, and I suppose there, Professor Surden, you could probably chime in here about the limitations on contractual solutions to, problems of interference. But the idea of penalizing using the government to penalize inadvertent, interference seems a bit unfair, and it seems that the market, through contractual agreements, could go a long way towards solving this issue.
So I think traditionally enforcement, I don't think there's been examples of anyone being hurt by the FCC for inadvertent noisy ballots and all. I think that's just gets closed down. It's a violation of the laws, but we have lots of people who are running illegal equipment. For example, in the CBRS band, if you use it in the United States, you're going to have to go through the spectrum access system and get permission, and you may not be allowed to do that in certain places where there are satellite receivers. But if you go onto eBay and you buy customer premise equipment that would work in China, straight band 4243, you can bring it right over here and use it illegally. And you might cause harm. And so that one's going to be a great and very easy use case. When we move to spectrum sharing, we're going to have, right now the market is pretty much, you go to Verizon if you want a band that covers the Verizon phone, done deal. When we do spectrum sharing, we're going to find many markets selling into the same piece of spectrum, and therefore much more opportunity for Alibaba or eBay to sell people equipment that would be legal in one context and wouldn't be legal in another. So it's going to be another of the unintended consequences of spectrum sharing, is that you won't have to be very sophisticated to violate the rules. Today, you've got to be. You won't have to.
And I'll just quickly follow up on that is, there's sort of, in the law, we distinguish two different roles for the government, at least two different. One is enforcement of rules, but a slightly different role is conflict resolution, where everybody's following the rules, but their well-meaning intentions are just conflicting with one another. It's often the role of the government to step in and pick a winner and a loser and resolve that conflict.
Another question? I saw another hand up over on this side.
Richard Bennett. So, John, you said a couple of interesting things that I think there's a connection between the two that you didn't really make explicit. We don't have enough sensors because of the locality of signals. But we can put storage in devices and sort of do digital forensics. Now, isn't the missing piece that, in fact, receivers who are being interfered with have a lot of information available about the nature of the interference that they're detecting. So you kind of have a built-in sensor every place where you need one. But the issue is receivers don't necessarily preserve the information that they're detecting to enable the digital forensics to take place after the fact. So one of the things that happened in Wi-Fi when DFS, distributed or dynamic frequency selection regulations were imposed on the 5 gigahertz band, we had to look for military radar. And the logic to look for military radar actually opened up a whole lot of information for us about what was happening in the radio domain around every receiver that became very useful for product development and debugging. So it kind of seems like technology is moving in that direction anyway. And maybe there's an opportunity here for regulation to kind of give it a little boost.
I couldn't agree more.
At this side, we've asked a couple questions on the left. Anyone on the right?
This is Boulder is all on the left.
We've
Thank you. This is a great panel, gentlemen. Just really briefly, John, you mentioned what I would call putting license plates on the car. And Preston talked a lot about the SAS and how that's going to enable a lot of information flow, some of which Richard was asking about just now. I'd love for you guys to talk about a little bit about the information that would be part of that flow. And then we've been talking about enforcement. When does the enforcement action turn into network management? When do you guys start saying, okay, we're going to start changing channels automatically, managing the spectrum as an asset according to the rules of law that are part of the licenses? That's sort of the end game in a lot of ways to what the SAS is sort of alluding to. Love to hear your comments when is it transition from enforcement to management?
Okay, so the first question there was, what kind of information would go in the digital license plate, I think, if I can interpret him correctly. It's pretty clear that to protect privacy, it needs to be just an opaque bag of bits. So what you're transmitting over the air is nothing that means anything unless you can present it to some authority with an appropriate indication that you have the right to know that information. The other thing is it's not a static bag of bits. It needs to change in a way that's not predictable or correlatable over time. Because if I can correlate your location over time, I already have broken your privacy in lots of deep ways. We're talking about a cryptographic sequence of bits, and there's some database somewhere that stores the corresponding key. And so, for example, that might be the spectrum access system. So if I have an interference problem and I retrieve that 64 or 128-bit sequence, then I send that information along with a timestamp, along with whatever enables me to break the code. I'll send that to the spectrum access system, and it gives me back perhaps an identity, perhaps an owner, perhaps other information. And the question about what that information should be that is associated with that digital license plate is, I think, a fundamental piece of research that's going to need to be done in coming years. So that answers your first question. Did you have a point?
I would just, well, on that one, I would resist that. I think I'm on the other side than John. Yeah. It's no longer a national ecosystem. It's an international ecosystem. The chips, we did a lot of work, the FCC, with that support by FCC, to not break the current LTE standards in 42 and 43 when we did CBRS. If we're going to do imaginative things in the United States, if they become US only, it's a big burden on consumers. It means people that aren't interested in internationally, and we break the benefits of volume. The reason this stuff is as cheap as it is, at least the Android versions, is because it's made in incredible volume to an international market. When we put US-only things on it, I think we go down a slippery slope of instead of being able to lead worldwide innovation, of putting ourselves in our own little hole. So if the whole world wanted to go with it and it went into every comm standard in the future, maybe. That means you go to the ITUs, that's 12 years off. So I think in the meantime, I think we should be leery of adding things on that change the nature of the technology and the process of developing it and the markets for it.
Okay. Dale, did you want to ask anything here at this point? Or?
No, I think that's maybe one last question.
One last question? Okay.
Steve Muir. So my question is, there's been a long history of the government protecting natural resources and moving towards using them in the most efficient way possible. Yet in this wireless world, we're enabling people who don't really need wireless. It seems to me that it's somewhat inappropriate that I sit at my desk, moving nowhere, with my access point plugged into my Ethernet jack, and I'm occupying the air from my access point to my desktop computer. So while we're doing all this massive enforcement and all these infrastructure-heavy things to manage the use and promote more use of the airwaves, why are we not also looking at suggesting that we be conserving these in situations that don't demand the mobility and the wireless behavior for the consumer?
We can ask you back, why don't you use a cable?
Actually, I do, because it works much better than the wireless in my neighborhood. But my point, is, I know
so it's an incentive structure.
There's hundreds of other people in my neighborhood that are doing this. The new houses are not even being wired anymore with Ethernet cables because the cost of the wire and the jacks is more expensive than the access point is. Yet those people are sitting at their desk and destroying or substantially impacting the noise floor and the usability in the true mobility cases for fixed cases. And we're seeing that with traffic lights. We're seeing that with a number of water meters, a gajillion other things. Why are we not spending any energy focusing on those use cases and making them non-wireless?
Well, if you make wireless expensive enough, people will do that. But that would be a shame. That would be the wrong answer. We should be making wireless so cheap people don't worry about using it. Cost would do it, but that's a horrible solution.
I think the very high frequency systems that we're seeing next, the next generation of unlicensed up at 60 gigahertz is such a short range propagation that really, I think the concern you're raising won't be such a concern for most applications that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, the funny thing about spectrum is we say it's finite, but it's always replenishing itself. So it's always there.
Very good.
Okay.
So another fabulous panel. So please join me in thanking Keith and everybody else. So we reconvene at 3:45.
Great. Well, that was endurable.